This stage in the project defines a true transition point. We're going to move from primarily using plywood in the tub construction to using cedar, which will make up a good portion of the rest of the build. And planing it down to the proper thickness is an initial starting point. Well, what the heck is a superstructure? Well, in building terminology, the superstructure typically refers to the portion of a building that exists above what they call the substructure. It's also the part that comprises the intended purpose of the building. So typically the substructure would be a basement, and the superstructure would be everything that rises above that. I thought that was a very fitting description for the portion of the build that we're doing now. In some ways, I kind of consider the tub, which we had built in the previous two videos, to really be more akin to the basement of a structure. It sits in the bed of the pickup truck, and it's typically not seen. So what we're making here are a set of columns. Now, you guys will see through this video that I actually am probably using the wrong terminology to refer to different parts. Traditionally, a column is going to be a piece that rises vertically that supports compression strength. I refer to these as beams later in the video. As you can see here, we are making one of the beams that will make the foundation of the superstructure or the frame structure that the cedar planking that skins the camper will be affixed to. These are made out of the same kind of cedar that will be the wall surface of the camper. And I've essentially painstakingly, as you guys saw in the time lapse, put these together. Now you'll notice here, this right here will function as a form of joinery. So the cross beam that will go perpendicular east to west, if you will, across the top of the roof section of the camper will actually fit in here to form a joint. This kind of construction technique is more akin to what you'd see in a piece of furniture, for example. And that's kind of an interesting point. My foundation of experience in woodworking is primarily, making furniture. And in a lot of ways, this camper is being built using a lot of the same techniques, and it's worked out very well. So we'll move on from here. Well, there you go. I used some of the wrong terminology. So there's no way for me to go back and reshoot those portions of the video. So just bear with me when I use some wrong terminology through the rest of it. But for clarity, the vertical structures that I'm installing right now would best be referred to as columns, and the portions that run horizontally across the east-west axis, I guess you could say, of this camper itself would best be referred to as beams. But nonetheless, I think you guys will get the point. For clarity, when I refer to the fact that I put these columns together, what that means is I cut individual strips and glued all of the boards together, or in other words, laminated the boards together to form the final shape of the columns and beams that you will see. Okay, as you guys can see here, I've actually started to attach the vertical beams that I had shown you previously to the outside edge of the wings of the camper. Okay, so what I did to do that is I brad nailed them in place with some glue down here. I drilled a pilot hole, and then I drove a large screw through the center and firmed these up. Now, one thing to consider here is because the wing is still unsupported, these are going to move a little bit. That's normal, and that's to be expected. This structure will only really become rigid and come to be as you add the different components together. Not one singular structure or piece is, the whole thing is going to firm up from that. So this is normal. These should be tight, though, when you screw them against the wing. Now, the spacing on these This is going to be something that if you were to build one that you would determine on your own. Now I know ideally these should be spaced somewhat evenly, and these are pretty close, within a couple inches of each, but I spaced them based on kind of my understanding of what the internal design is going to be. So I'll show you guys where we're at here. So these beams are 1.5 inches wide, so keep all that in mind. So from front up is 24.5. The middle spacing is 26.25, and then from the very front to the back is 26. And then you add in an additional 6 inches for the width of the beams, and that will come up to 83 inches, which is the length of mine. Another real important point at this stage is the height of these beams will start to define the roof line of your camper. So hopefully you guys can see this, but these two front beams are the same exact height, because with this camper I'm going to try to create a somewhat consistent even arch from the back to the over in the cab over section, which is obviously not built yet. These latter two beams here and here progressively get lower, because the rear of the roof of the camper will actually slope downward slightly. So I will show you the heights that I came up with. So the rear one, from the top down to the wing, to the top of the wing, is 52. The next one is 55. And then the two right here that are the same height are 57.5. Okay? Now remember, that's on top of the wing. So there's an additional 22 inches roughly of height to the floor to the top of that wing. So you just do the math, and that gives you the total overall height. Now, that's not the whole story, though. This will become more clear later when I start installing the vertical beams. But the vertical beams will come into here, right? And then there's going to be some element of shaping and sanding and contouring that will define the roof line. And my point, though, is this is a very important step. It's important to take the time to assemble these beams. It seems like a lot of work to, cut down these individual pieces and laminate them together. But I think, at least in my opinion, creates the strongest and most versatile method of establishing these beams. But also the height and the shape that you go right here is really going to start to define the roof line and becomes critical later, which you guys will see in subsequent videos. What you see here is the process for how I'm actually laminating the wood together to make the horizontal beams, or just simply the beams of the camper. As you can see, I cut individual pieces of wood down into strips. So in this case, it was about a 4.5 inch strip. And then I laminated or glued together all of the individual boards. I use those little 1-inch screws to kind of help hold everything together, along with clamps. As you can see here, I'm actually putting those in place. It's going to be real important that you make sure that you're comfortable with the squareness of the intersection between these beams and columns at this point, because once that glue hardens up, you're not going to have a whole lot of room to make some changes and movements when you move on to the parts to build. Well, folks, as you can see, we're making some pretty good progress on the superstructure here, the main framing. But I've got an important lesson. This beam right here is just not up to snuff. And I'm going to try to salvage it and do a little bit of sanding But ultimately, when I was cutting in the curves today, it didn't turn out like I liked. And this brings up a real important lesson. When building a project like this, if you want it to be as good as it can be, you've got to learn two things. Number one is take your time. I've stressed that multiple times throughout these discussions. A project that you rush will be a project that you're less proud of unless you have no other choice otherwise. And number two is sometimes, even though it's a waste of material and a waste of time, if something doesn't meet standards, you got to start over. Because letting little things pass that matter because you don't feel like redoing it, that's going to be a recipe for a project that doesn't turn out as well as you'd like. So everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes they don't work out. I'm going to give this one a little bit more work, but I think ultimately this one isn't going to make the pass. I'll have to start over. So I'll see you guys in a bit. Let me show you guys something real quick right here. When you assemble these beams, I took these 1-inch screws. These are just a 1-inch screw with a flat head. Let me get a little closer so you can see here. It's a little dusty. So I basically took, and you see I added some 3/4-inch brad nails to hold these together, and then I took these screws and drove them through. These are pretty symmetrical in this one, but some of them, like this one back here, are a little bit more random if I saw parts of the wood that was just a little bit twisted, and that's normal. Now you can see these beams are 2 boards thick, so therefore they're 1 inch thick. The back one is, and this one also. And then this front beam here, which will be the one immediately adjacent to the cab over, is 3 boards thick. All right. Now, I'm not an engineer. That's just been my experience that those thicknesses work out. Mind you, this rear one back here will actually end up being about 4 boards thick, because remember, we're going to have a sheathed layer on the outside and then have a trim piece. So, and then the way that these fit in this joint here, so this one is, let's see if this one's a little bit more mobile here. So these will just fit in like this. Yeah, hold on a second. There we go. See how that fit in? So I'll add some glue and then I'll drive a screw. Now, one thing about these screws is you don't want to split this board right here. So make sure you do a good pilot hole. And what I do is I put one at the lower end on one side and then one on the upper end. But seriously, this wood's pretty soft, so make sure you do a good pilot hole in that. And just those 2 screws is going to be enough. And then of course adding wood glue, and that will be, this joint right here will be as strong as the rest of the wood. It will almost be like one continuous piece. So that's just a little tip on there. A side note, I left it in the clip because I think it's still an important lesson, but I was actually able to salvage this piece. I took out my belt sander and ran it over a few times, and it's going to be fine. So I was able to salvage it, but I'll be back with you guys. Yeah, it's starting to take shape now. Like I talked about before, this is an organic process. I don't have plans, and everything I make I essentially have in my head. I have some broad vision of where I want to go, but we move from there. The bottom line is take your time and be thoughtful at these portions of the project that are going to really define the path and the direction that the rest of the project will go. Well, congratulations. You have survived spending this much time with me. God bless you. Now, just kidding aside, here we are. We're going to go ahead and end the videos for week 4. And as you can see, we got the initial portion of what I call the superstructure done. This is a key aspect of the project. It defines the roof line. It defines the upper area in the main camper section that will be the living space, and it will define the foundation that we will move forward to build the cab over section. So congratulations if you made it this far, and we'll see you guys on the live on Tuesday, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.